My kickoff point is something which I've just received in connection with my work for circulation to students, which is the Times Law Awards 2022 essay competition. And the question for this year's Times Law Awards student essay competition, sponsored by One Essex Court, is to no, quote, to no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. Magna Carta, Clause 40. Title, is the state financing the criminal justice system properly? And if not, is privatization a possible solution? Would this mean selling justice? The point, I think, is should be a reasonable illustration of the point which I made in my most recent article in the series, which is that the ancient constitution, the idea of the British ancient constitution, is alive and well in the 21st century. Well, perhaps not quite as well as it might be, but is unambiguous, alive and kicking in the 21st century. And it is still the case that people argue about the rules of Magna Carta, and indeed argue about the Norman conquest and the Treaty of Ligulae and the surrender of England to the papacy by King John, and all the other stuff of this sort is still live politics. And indeed the question of whether whether Britain could be pulled out of Europe by the royal prerogative without there being an act of parliament, and so on and so on and so on. This is live stuff. Second observation is one which is absolutely immediate politics, very immediate politics. The Owen Paterson story. This guy got busted by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner for lobbying for money in his capacity as an MP. And Boris Johnson's initial view, well, particularly not just of Boris Johnson, but of his government, the initial view of the government was that this was a bad idea, and that they wanted to overthrow both Paterson's condemnation by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner and indeed the whole parliamentary standards regime. They want to create a new parliamentary standards regime. And seeing as the Tory party has a large majority, holding 360 out of 650 seats in Parliament, even the existence of a substantial Tory rebellion in the House of Commons didn't prevent the proposal going through. But within 2 days, Boris Johnson did a U-turn. And he did a U-turn essentially because the media didn't like, let's put it as simply as this, the media didn't like the idea of the Tories abolishing the current regime of controlling MP sleaze. And indeed, what's happened has not just been that Boris Johnson has done a U-turn, but that the Tory sleaze story has become one which has run for the last fortnight and is giving rise to considerable embarrassment in the of the government, and indeed to sudden reversal in the polls, that their lead over the Labour Party in the polls has gone away. U-turn is not by any means the only U-turn which the government has executed. Planning law, one of the things which is regarded as being actually quite fundamental, that Britain has got a serious housing problem, and the Tories' solution to this serious housing problem is to do a radical overhaul of planning law in order to enable building new houses. It's actually unlikely that this will work, do the job that it's supposed to do, because the underlying problem is that the builders don't want to build on brownfield sites and don't want to build houses for the poor. in consequence, actually, however much you liberalize the planning laws, all that liberalizing the planning laws is going to do is produce more production of high value houses on greenfield sites suitable only for commuters to the city. So nonetheless, that was the only policy which they had. The idea of the alternative, which would be to abolish council house sales and set free the councils to build new council housing, is unthinkable, is not only unthinkable to the Tory party, but is also unthinkable to the Labour Party. And in consequence, on the housing question, Parliament, society, the political process is gridlocked. It's impossible to reach conclusion to do anything of substance about the housing question. We can see in point of fact the same thing at work in relation to HS2. Now people can have wildly differing views of the merits or otherwise of HS2, the HS2 high-speed line from London to Birmingham, and to be honest, I think the negatives have a good deal on their side. But the reality of the matter is, again, that governments with clear majorities, whether it's the coalition government or the present Tory government, have been unable to force through anything beyond the London to Birmingham stage of HS2. The political process is gridlocked as far as internal affairs is concerned. But this gridlocking of the political process has got nothing to do with the theoretical legal position in constitution. The theoretical legal position is the Queen, when she acts in Parliament, is sovereign. She's not sovereign outside of acting in Parliament, but when she acts in Parliament by the assent of the Lords and Commons, House of Lords and House of Commons, she is sovereign. And therefore, a government which has a clear parliamentary majority ought to be able to overcome obstacles, to bulldoze its way through to create decisive decision-making. It isn't able to do so. The gridlock is coming from political processes, not from juridical processes. Conversely, the United States, where we started from with this discussion, is that the United States Constitution is gridlocked. And that's very much clear. It's quite, we've got Biden unable to deliver anything more than a fairly minimalist infrastructure reform. Okay, it's a lot of money. It's a big bung to the construction firms. But in terms of what his constituents, his supporters voted for, this is not very serious. And he's unable to do that, in essence, because the Democratic Party is split, because the bribe payers to the Democrats have people who they will back them in blocking major change in any which is in any sense in the interests of the working class. And the Republican Party, on the other hand, is solid, and by virtue of the constitutional structure of the United States, the rural classes control the Senate. And from that point of view, the ability of any democratic administration to do anything of any substance other than good favors to high rate taxpayers is extremely limited. Okay, but nonetheless, is this the case that the US Congress and administrations are gridlocked on everything? No. The reality is that the US Congress and the administrations are not gridlocked on any issue of foreign policy. In spite of the changes in rhetoric between the Trump Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration. There is continuity through these three administrations in relation to the policy of pivot to Asia, meaning a policy of developing encirclement and increasingly aggressive encirclement of China, in relation equally to the policy of defense of the Ukraine and the efforts to get the Europeans on side with a shooting war in eastern Ukraine, in relation to sanctions on Iran. It turned out that there was very limited movement by the Obama administration, and while there was sharp movement by the Trump administration, the Biden administration has not significantly rowed back, but has continued to demand from the Iranian government that it make more concessions than those which were made for the nuclear deal under Obama. So the reality is the US, the structure of US politics is characterized by bipartisanship on international and military affairs. And the gridlock which exists is only a gridlock, is not a gridlock against tax cuts for the rich. It's only a gridlock against welfare measures for the poor. It's only a gridlock against measures which would reduce gerrymandering and so on and so on and so on. And as Ben Cosin has just said in the chat, this is of course equally true of UK politics, that what appears as gridlock in UK politics is principally gridlock against anything which moves against the interests of the city and of donors to the Conservative Party. Okay, so what we're talking about then, what we started talking about, what the whole series of articles and the debate has been about, is about the question, is the phenomenon of gridlock on domestic politics in the United States a product of the antiquity of the US Constitution? Conversely, are the various features of British politics a product of the antiquity of the British Constitution, which on any terms is a great deal more antique than the US Constitution, with its monarchy, established church, matters being done by the royal prerogative, a House of Lords. Okay, the House of Lords is now a nominated, primarily a nominated body, but it still includes the bishops and it still includes a significant chunk of hereditary peers, and so on and so on and so on. And in a sense, that's my, at one level, that's my end of story, but I don't want to stop at the end of story. I think it's more interesting and significant to think more generally about what is a constitution, about why it is necessary for rising classes to overthrow the pre-existing constitution in order to develop the new social order of which they are bearers. Of the relationship between the rise of capitalism and the feudal constitutions, and therefore why we have this strange ideology in England of the ancient constitution. And further about capitalist constitutions and why all capitalist constitutions are engines of minority rule, even though they hold themselves out as being, quote, democracies, unquote. That's got nothing to do with, well, it's an ideology which has a limited expression in the right to vote every so many years, but whoever you vote for, the government will get in, as the anarchists rightly say. Okay, so I start then with what's a constitution? And I think that a constitution basically has two sides to it. And the first side is that it's a set of rules and practices of decision making. Now, that set of rules and practices of decision making is characteristically of a state, but we can perfectly well talk about the constitution of a party or the constitution of a private society or a church or a bowls club or whatever the hell it is. The rules and practices, it's important to be clear, are not all legal rules. Now, I want to pin down two aspects of this. The first is if something, the mere fact that something is written down in a statute doesn't make it a legal rule. Legal rules are rules which are justiciable, which a court is willing to enforce if they are understood to be infringed or broken. Now, legal rules, therefore, don't have to be statutory, and indeed an awful lot of both English law and American law is non-statutory, quote, common law, precedent doctrine, and so on and so forth. Conversely, however, there are rules contained in statute which are not enforceable in any court. And to the extent that they're contained in statute but not enforceable by any court, it's probably best to regard them as ideological statements by government, representations by government about how government will act. The clearest example, just the clearest English example of this is the Education Act 1944, which contains a whole load of provisions about councils providing public schools, about the organization, state schools, about the organization of state schools, about the regulation and government of state schools, etc., etc., etc. And only one justiciable clause. The one justiciable clause is one which actually isn't enforced, which is that every school must have an act of Christian worship every morning. In practice, most schools dodge around this by holding a more or less fuzzy ethics assembly of one sort and another. But the statutory rule, which is enforceable, is just that. We've got actually similar things in the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States says that the right to declare war is vested in the Congress, bang, in the Congress. Now, on the straight originalist understanding of what that meant, i.e. what the guys who drafted this text meant in the late 1700s, it's pretty clear that they meant that the USA was not entitled to engage in military operations on its own initiative outside of the United States without congressional approval. It's not that the president couldn't engage in military operations in defense of the United States in the case the country was invaded, as it was. The last country to invade the United States was the UK in 1812. That's no problem, but taking aggressive military action without a declaration of war was understood in the international law of the period to be merely piracy or armed robbery, and not without the declaration of war. It was just an ordinary crime, enforceable and not protected by any act of state doctrine or any of that stuff. Okay, but as far as the US Supreme Court is concerned, this provision is not justiciable. It's not justiciable because it can't give rise to a, quote, causal controversy between private individuals. Nobody can suffer any loss who has any standing to sue in the courts of the United States, because the guys who the President of the United States drops bombs on as a result of unauthorized military operations overseas don't have standing to sue in the courts of the United States, because as far as they're concerned, what the United States has done is acts of state. And conversely, even if the congressional actors say that they want to litigate the question of the war powers under the Congress, the Supreme Court will not accept such a suit because it doesn't represent a cause or controversy, because the members of Congress lose nothing by virtue of the president's action. And in consequence, it wasn't the case before the Second World War, but since the Second World War, it has been the routine practice of the US presidency to go to war without the consent of the Congress. And indeed, there's a whole raft of other stuff. We've got litigation now going on about Trump's assertion of executive privilege for his discussions about how to make a coup d'etat, or alleged discussions about how to make a coup d'etat in the run-up to around the time of the presidential election and the attempted invasion of Capitol Hill and all of that stuff. This claim of executive privilege is based on the English royal prerogative privilege, which we got rid of, well, not we got rid of, but we changed the rules for this. It's now called public interest immunity. In the 1960s, 1970s, the courts in this country changed the rules, but it's originally a royal prerogative. And the claim that there's a royal prerogative to keep information from Parliament, which is essentially what's being claimed in relation to the congressional subpoenas and executive privilege in the United States, is not a claim which was made even by Charles I. Queen Elizabeth would have made that claim. In fact, she would have thrown the MPs who wanted to question what she was doing into jail, pending. That's the way in which she, or her father for that matter, ran the show. But in this case, this is not something, again, there is a process whereby, because there is the cause or controversy rule understood in the US Supreme Court, has the effect that there's a gradual accretion of power to the executive. And that gradual accretion of power to the executive also reflects more generally the role of the, quote, imperial presidency, as the United States has become bigger and bigger and bigger as an imperialist power. Okay, so these rules then, the rule that you can't litigate is a customary rule, what's called in England a convention of the Constitution, and it's a customary rule which overrules the statutory rule. So constitutions then are rules and practices of decision making, which may be legal rules or may be customary rules, but you can't exclude there being customary rules. The second thing which constitutions are is that they're principles of loyalty which organize the loyalty of state actors. And we need to organize the loyalty of state actors because, other things apart, a state is just a protection racket. State is just a bunch of guys with guns who point them, or guns, or before that, swords and spears and bows and arrows and stuff like that, who point them at the general public and extract taxes from the general public. Okay, states actually do things which are to a greater or lesser extent useful, but they are vulnerable to exactly the same problem as armies, which if they have a victory and then they break up in order to loot, the army ceases to be an organized force. And there needs to be some organized principle in the organization of the state which holds the state officials back from just stealing things. Mm. Not, they do steal things. They're not going to stop stealing things altogether, but it holds them back from stealing things to the point that the whole apparatus collapses. And we can, in fact, see examples. Most recently, the Afghanistan puppet regime. The guys in the state just stole everything, and in consequence, the soldiers didn't get paid and they weren't willing to fight. But in fact, the same thing happened in the last years of the Tsarist regime. The extent of corruption in the logistics apparatus of the Tsarist regime in 1914 to 17 was such that the regime was unable to deliver both food to the cities and food and munitions to the armed forces, which is what triggers 1917. The white armies in the aftermath of 1917 during the Civil War period become very rapidly just gangs of looters. The same thing happens in the collapse of the South Vietnamese regime in 1975. The armed forces break up into disorganized gangs of looters. You don't see so much of it because the North Vietnamese army comes in and takes over, and it is not such an obvious collapse. Okay, so we need the two sides of this, one of which has got rules for decision making, and the other side of it is those rules for decision making also serve as an ideology which holds the state officials back from looting. Now, the ideology which holds the state officials back from looting has the consequence that the state officials are loyal to the principles which are expressed in the constitutional conception. And those principles which are expressed in the constitutional conception are the ideas of part of the ideas of the ruling class. So the feudal state is characterized, feudalism is characterized by the split of the exploiting class between the military nobility on the one hand and the clergy on the other hand, with going along with that, the ability of the primary producers to maneuver between the local parson or abbot and the local squire or daimyo. With the result that there is substantial growth in the forces of production arising from the ability of the primary producers to reinvest, which doesn't exist in the classical antiquities. In classical antiquity, it has to be, reinvestment has to be from the members of the ruling class. Okay. But how do we understand, because we don't understand the villeins as being outside of society, how do we understand the right to rule? And the answer is the right to rule is given by the personal inherited characteristics of the knight, the gentleman, the baron, the prince, but also, on the other hand, is given by the personal sanctity of the clergyman. But the consequence of this dependence on the personality of the ruler, the personality of the clergyman, is against the interests of the development of proto-capitalism. The reason being, capitalism involves money put into commodities. The commodities are then worked up through a production process involving collective activity by groups of workers, wage workers. The produced commodity, C dash, then has to be sold off and realized as M dash with a profit at the end of it. And the problem with the feudal state is that it's all too easy for the personal character of the monarch or the personal character of a bishop or whatever to interfere with the process. I gave him one of the examples of the articles, the example of Andrew Yarrington He and his partners put a lot of money invested a lot of money into working out tin plating and buying the tin plating process from the prior inventors in Saxony, only to discover when they were ready to go to market that King Charles II had privately given a patent for tin plating to a mate of his. And King Charles II's mate, having personal access to the king, he knocks Yarrington and his partners out of the picture. But we can see equally in Renaissance Florence, Savonarola gets up he's just one of many examples of people in the Middle Ages, gets up an agitation against the currently constituted authorities on the basis that they're tolerating usury and exploitation and stuff which is inconsistent with Christian law. Now, the point is not that Christian law prohibits profit. The point is that Christian law can be read as prohibiting profit, and somebody can get themselves up as a holy man, a sacred man, by arbitrarily interfering with the circulation of capital. So that the capitalists need a new state form, which isn't a state form based on the government of men, whether it's the government of princes because of their natural nobility, shown even in the most difficult circumstances, the lost prince who is brought up as a peasant and then pulls the sword out of the stone, or otherwise is discovered to be the true prince. There's endless medieval stories along this line, nor in relation to the saint who gets up a agitation for a crusade or for a suppression of usury or whatever, etc., etc., etc. The capitalist state needs to be a, quote, rule of law state. Yeah. And that's already the case in the medieval Italian city-states. The first way in which they start thinking about being a rule of law state and the prince being subject to the law is to say that they're Rome, and to say that they're subject to Roman law. And Pisa in the 1160s is already saying Pisa has for many years lived subject to Roman law. It's easier for them to say this because they are the guys who had the 6th century manuscript copy of the digest of the Emperor Justinian written in the 6th century in their hands. So they had a more easy access to Roman law sources than some other people. But it's a very widespread thing. We appeal to Rome. We are the heirs of the ancient republic. And this is not by any means unique. Marx wrote in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte about how the French Revolution is dressed in the clothes of ancient Rome. They weren't by any means the first people to do so. One of the most popular plays of the reign of Queen Anne was a play called Lucius Junius Brutus, which is about the foundation of the Roman Republic. It's a Whig play about the foundation of the Roman Republic. The guys in the political opposition in the 1720s wrote a series of letters called Cato's, under the title Cato's Letters, again appealing to the Roman Republic as their background. The American revolutionaries similarly appealed to the Roman Republic. So this appeal to Rome is a common thing. There is a problem with it. It's a poison chalice. And the reason why it's a poison chalice is because actually you say we appeal to ancient Rome, but the Roman law sources that we have are actually sources from the Emperor Justinian, who was a Christian emperor in the 6th century AD. And the sources have precisely the idea that the will of the prince, the will of the emperor is the force of law, that the emperor is not bound by the laws. And they also actually have explicit provision for the jurisdiction of bishops over issues and usury and all of this stuff. It's all there in the Justinianic sources. Later on, it came to be the case that people started to say, oh, well, we don't want that Justinianic law. We want Roman law as it was in Republican times. So Francois Hotman, French, I'll put it up in the chat in a minute, but not now, wrote a book called Anti-Tribonian, which appealed against Tribonian, who wrote Justinian's codification, chaired the codification commission, to older law. In the 19th century, guys argued about the law of business Rome, meaning Rome of the Republican and early imperial period. So that, but nonetheless, the problem, it's a poison chalice, and the people who succeeded in creating independent states are the Genoese and the Venetians, who didn't follow the Roman law as our rule line, but instead says we have ancient constitutions which go back to immemorial antiquity. And these ancient constitutions, which go back to immemorial antiquity, make us autonomous. The Venetians did it the biggest possible scale. They set up somebody called the Patriarch of Venice, who is supposed to rank equally with the Pope, though of course he's subordinate to the Senate and Council of the Venetian Republic. And the same happens in relation to the Netherlands and Britain, that we have the development of the idea of an ancient constitution, which is so ancient and so powerful that it holds the king in subordination. And therefore it holds all the magistrates in subordination, that it's an immemorial, a constitution which goes back to time immemorial, and some really weird history stuff, things which were said to be before the Roman conquest of Batavia, the Netherlands, or before the Romans came to Britain, stuff like that. The ancient constitution is a device to allow you to have a rule of law state. The ancient constitutionalist line is run actually not just by the British, the English, I should say, and the Netherlanders and the Italian city-states. It's attempted by, I just referred to Francois Hotman, the Protestant revolutionaries in France, but they lost. Instead, the French state developed as an absolute sovereign state. L'État, c'est moi, says Louis XIV. The state is me. And the ancient constitutionalist guys wound up as emigres operating in the Netherlands and in London, where they played a significant role in the capitalist communities. Similarly, ancient constitutionalist arguments were run in Germany in very different circumstance in Germany, because in Germany what happens is that the equivalents in Germany of the Duke of this and the Earl of that and the Bishop of the other become sovereign princes. And they too adopt the indivisible sovereignty, and the sovereignty is in me, the King of Prussia, or in me, the Prince of Bavaria, or in me, the Elector of Hanover, or the Archbishop of Cologne, as the case may be, these various different characters. Now, what happens then is these are experiments which allow you to have a rule of law state. The result of the geopolitics of the creation of the rule of law state in the Netherlands and in England is that by the early 1700s, everybody's thinking, or not everybody, but all the sort of guys who would quite like to have something better than the feudal/religious regime are thinking, we want some of that. And they aren't thinking it, however, as this is our ancient constitution. This is the Neapolitan, the ancient constitution of Naples, for example. Rather, they're thinking the English, the Dutch and the English have shown that there is progress, that the world moves forward, that things get better. And this progress is leading towards enlightenment. And the Enlightenment then means we can redesign our constitution to make an enlightened constitution, one which is the product not of an remote and hoary antiquity, but of redesign. Now, the redesign is characteristically involves rule of law, and it involves rule of law. The form of it involving rule of law is that you write the constitution down as if it was a statute or the constitution of a town or a club or whatever, college or whatever it might be. All of these things have had written constitutions since the late Middle Ages. But Enlightenment turns out also to be poison chalice for the capitalist class. The reason why Enlightenment is a poison chalice for the capitalist class is that the capitalist constitution, although it needs to be a rule of law constitution, but it also needs to be a regime of minority rule. It has to be a regime of minority rule because the capitalist class is a minority class, because the capitalism which produces the great military capabilities, which produces the geopolitical advantage of the Netherlands and Britain over France, is precisely the form of production in which we go money, commodity, and then production by organized wage workers, commodity, money. It's the unity of the market and the factory, even if the factory that we're concerned with is not steam-driven machines, but wind-driven machines, the big ships and watermill-driven machines, and the large-scale mining operations, foundries, and so on and so on. So there's a problem with pure Enlightenment, which is that it's not finding a sufficient reflection for the authority relations. There's the two sides of capitalism. On the one side, it's freedom and equality in the market. On the other side, it's sharp hierarchical authority relations in the workplace. Both parts of that are capitalism. It's not that there's a sort of either that the factory is the epitome of modernity, which the guys who were fans of the German regime, so Pavas and those guys, thought that Germany, and Hilferding and co, thought Germany had organized capitalism as opposed to the disorganized liberalism of Britain and the United States, and that organized capitalism was the way of the future. That picks up one side. On the other side, the Enlightenment policy just picks up the other half, just looks at freedom and equality in the market and forgets about the presence of hierarchy and authority in the workplace. Hence the point that that Enlightenment constitutionalism is contradictory from the point of view of capital. It's problematic. On the one hand, its great advantage over ancient constitutionalism is that you're set free from whatever the hell happened hundreds of years ago. You're no longer arguing about the meaning of the Norman conquest or about the Batavians or etc., etc., etc. On the other hand, however, there's also a real danger that Enlightenment ideas lead to the ideas of, hey, if we have enlightened ideas, why should I be subordinate to the foreman on shop floor or my line manager? Or why should we as small operators of one sort and another be outbribed? Why should it be the case that the big capitalists have priority access to the MPs, which the rest of us don't have? Why might it not be the case, indeed, that there's a future after capitalism? If we accept that there is indeed progress in history, then yeah, there might be a future beyond capitalism. It might not be just stop where we are. We might be able to think in terms of Spencean communism or Owenite cooperation or the red republicanism of Helen Macfarlane or Marxism for that matter. And so capital moves away from straight Enlightenment constitutionalism. It's a to and fro process. It's not there's no Enlightenment constitutionalism doesn't just disappear, but capital moves away. And in the States, the form which this takes is, quote, originalism, unquote. Originalism theoretically says we have to interpret the US Constitution on the basis that what the guys writing in the 1780s meant is the only thing that what the document means. Except it turns out that the originalists and this doctrine of originalism emerged actually along with Reaganism and neoliberalism and all the rest of this stuff. This is part of the reaction in the 1980s. But it turned out after 10 or 20 years that the originalists are no longer interested in hearing from historians of the 18th century what the intellectual context of the guys writing in the 1780s was. On the contrary, they have a construct. And this historical construct of modern originalism of Antonin Scalia and all these other guys in the US Supreme Court and on the right is a peculiar image of a sort of rose-tinted spectacles image of the past, which has indeed very much the same sort of character as Edward Cook's fantasies of the Anglo-Saxon Parliament and the common belief of the 17th century guys of the Norman yoke, that Norman society, which in fact abolished chattel slavery after the Normans came into England, that chattel slavery disappeared. It had been very widespread and extensive in Anglo-Saxon England. This idea that there was freedom in Anglo-Saxon England and the Normans took it away, all of these various aspects of the ancient constitution, which we have equally now. The story of the Lord Chancellor, the office of Lord Chancellor goes back to 604 AD. Excuse me? There wasn't a Kingdom of England in 604 AD. All of this sort of fantasy history, the originalists are writing fantasy history of the same sort in relation to the United States, but in relation to a much more recent period of time. And it's just as much, it seems to be, I have to say, I think on both sides, almost immune to historical criticism. Nonetheless, I'm going to jump out of that, and my point was the return of ancient constitutionalism, which I didn't write about in the articles, but I do think is pertinent. We need to think about what would be the proletarian constitution. We need to think about that because it's a question of what alternative is available to capitalist constitutionalism. Capitalist constitutionalism is about minority rule. The presence of these judicial review institutions And in England, although judicial review is weak, the judicial right to interpret statute can be such as to wipe out the effect of the statute altogether. Dear me. Tiencia against Vision Enterprises in the early 2000s is about a statute which required that the landlord should pay the tenant deposit to an independent stakeholder. And if the landlord didn't pay the tenant deposit to the independent stakeholder, then the landlord was barred from recovering rent. Okay, so then the Court of Appeal, by a 2-to-1 decision in Tiencia, holds that the statute is satisfied if the landlord pays to the independent stakeholder 2 minutes before judgment is given in the actual litigation to recover the rent. The effect of which is to render the statute completely ineffective. So these are all minority rule. We are concerned with the proletariat as a class, as a majority class. I want to be a little, obviously we have to be a little bit cautious about this, but I would say, I think that the proletariat, at least in this country, is a majority class. We need to understand that. In order to understand that, we have to actually count the kids as part of the proletariat, and most of the people who are unemployed, who haven't given up and decided to make a living from petty crime, which is actually a form of small business. On the other hand, the small business operators, of whom there are about 5 million, aren't part of the proletariat. But then I think if we add this all together, actually it turns out that the proletariat is a majority class in Britain. There are large-ish, substantial middle classes and so on, but we can think of the proletariat as a majority class. Further, it needs political democracy in order to organize itself. We can see this. Both Stalinism and social democracy have tested to destruction the idea that you can have powerful workers' organizations without political democracy. In reality, the destruction of political democracy in the workers' organizations erodes the effectiveness, reduces the trade unions and the Labour Party and things like this to empty shells, which are incapable of actually defeating and resisting the attacks of the capitalist class. What is political democracy, however? It's not straightforwardly a rules system, or certainly not a legal rules system. Because a legal rules system is precisely a system in which the last word as to what the rules are is held by judges. The rule of law is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And that's just as much true of, quote, socialist legality as it is of the conventional rule of law. Political democracy has to be a practice, a customary practice, which returns the decisions as far as possible, that it's a convention, that the decisions go back as far as possible to the ranks. I want to be cautious with this. Paul Cockshott proposed in a text, I can't remember which I wrote against some years ago, universal online referenda with the right of initiative, that anybody has the right to make a proposal. And my response to that is, yeah, I get up in the morning and I open my email, and the first thing I find is 25 million referendum proposals to be voted on. The reality is that the decision-making process is not, it requires us to have mechanisms which sift through, which define and limit the range of choices which we're making, and the processes by which we define and limit the choices by which we're making involve political representation, they involve the organization of factions, parties, and so on and so on. And thinking about political democracy, if we think thoroughly about political democracy, it will become apparent that actually political democracy, first place, is necessarily, it's about a customary regime, and it's about principles which shape and guide how we do our decision-making process. Is this a matter which has to be decided right now, bang, bang, or can it go back to the larger group and back in turn to the general membership? Too much of the far left, but it's also the trade union movement as well, just tries to decide things without going back to the general membership on the basis that it's urgent that something should be done. Sometimes it really is urgent that something should be done. If there's a fire, somebody's got to order the fire engines out, and so on and so on. But there are a lot of things where it isn't actually that urgent that something should be done, and the issue should go back to the membership. But we need the process of deciding what issues, the process of filtering down the however many billion individual people it is in the world, down to an actual workable decision process. And thinking about that actually entails us thinking about this, as I say, not as rules of law, not as complex Heath Robinson constitution a la left unity. We had the experience of this left formation, left unity, had a really complicated constitution which didn't work. Yeah. But as political practice and political custom and political principle, and that why have I raised this in this context is because actually that's essential, that we think democracy outside of thinking of the juridical. We think democracy in terms of the custom and practice, and not in terms of the juridical constitution, and not in terms of the judge as savior from on high to deliver us. That's it. I'm finishing there.